Hello, and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights for environment, social, and governance leaders. We're glad that you chose to join us today, whether it's your first time or you're tuning in for season 2 and you're an avid listener. We're delighted to bring to you today Matt Sekol from Microsoft. Matt also writes a weekly newsletter for ESG individuals called the ESG Advocate. It covers all things sustainability news, and I think does a tremendous job of tackling complexity and nuances of ESG. So he was highly recommended to us to check him out. And as we started to unpack, something very interesting happened in March, Matt, which I think our users will know. Silicon Valley Bank failed after a bank run. It was the second largest bank failure in the United States history. And it's been the greatest since the 2008 financial crisis. And so I thought it'd be interesting because you wrote in your newsletter about SVB failed to realize how those stakeholders would have behaved if the bank experienced risk. And understanding stakeholders like this is a core governance issue. And we thought it would be fun to bring you on the show and really unpack this unique perspective. So Matt, welcome to the show. And why don't we start there? Unpack this for us. Why you chose to take that angle in that position?
Sure. So I tend to see ESG in everything. And when it comes to the social, stakeholders are really at the center of all the issues. For SVB, what was interesting was they had a unique stakeholder opportunity that they were going after 40 years ago. They saw customers out there that were startups. Big corporate banks were shying away from them. And they saw the opportunity to engage and offer services to them. So they had a very unique stakeholder niche there. But stakeholders can change over time. And startups, over the past decade especially, they became a really close-knit community where they have common connections outside of the bank and outside the industries in which they're trying to disrupt. And the way that they work across VCs, incubators, and with each other even, it almost reminds me of private equity because there's that level of influence in the ecosystem. And so as VC funding pulled back in summer of last year, the bank I'm sure they felt this pressure quickly because they took action on it, but they should have recognized that withdrawals were coming, that unique operating model for those stakeholders as startups would require them to take withdrawals because they had to cover active expenses like payrolls. And maybe this would cause a run. Now, besides that one stakeholder view, there's a little bit of another one, which is many startups are digital natives, which means that for them, technology is foundational and fundamental. So when you offer them something as seemingly innocuous as a way to digitally transfer or withdraw funds, they're going to take advantage of it. And that means that those funds might move out pretty quickly, which is what I think we really saw. Ultimately, though, looking at stakeholders, they approached it with a very niche opportunity towards their stakeholders, but it ultimately became a risk in the end.
I appreciate that you unpacked that as a opportunity and a risk. I also want to double click on your notion that stakeholders can change over the course of time, their behavior to turn up opportunity or turn on the risk of an organization. So let's go there. I mean, outside of SVP and even thinking about banking in general, what does this practice look like in order to keep a pulse and ahead of your stakeholder risk and opportunities?
Well, you know what? That's a really great question. And I think it's interesting because it's a little bit new, to be honest. For a long time, companies led with shareholder pressure, and they would do risk examinations and maybe understand their stakeholders as SVB did 40 years ago, at least in certain ways. But around 2019, when the Business Roundtable started changing their messaging on their governance to focus more on stakeholders, and we had Larry Fink writing these CEO newsletters since 2015, companies really had an opportunity to be empowered to engage and learn about stakeholders in a new way. Today, we're seeing that that stakeholder pressure even manifests through the legacy shareholder pressure with new shareholder proposals that are leading to proxy votes and all sorts of interesting things. So if I was, and I'm not on any boards, if I was on a board today, what I would be thinking about is the broad ecosystem of stakeholders. There's a very simple exercise that a CRO, a chief risk officer, or really anybody in the business can do. That's a stakeholder mapping exercise to really understand deeply what your who your stakeholders are. So as an example, you might have employees as a stakeholder group. Don't stop there, because employees, you have back office employees, you might have frontline workers, all sorts of different categories of stakeholders, all with different needs, all with different expectations. And this hits across customers. You might have different unique customer stakeholders, different unique supplier stakeholders. Really go through that exercise and pay attention to them on a regular basis. That means pulling in data from the signals where you can pull them from. For employees, it might be internal collaboration tools. Microsoft happens to make great ones of those. Customer signals from things like social media or your CRM system. It could be surveys. And then suppliers, I see a lot of great engagement models from procurement teams, especially because of ESG on this topic. But really kind of structuring a feedback loop around those stakeholders to get that feedback up to the board and up to your executive level, and then act on it. That's really the way that I think to kind of mitigate these issues before they come up, so that you can see the stakeholder changes in advance.
I think it's interesting. In an early show, we talked about dynamic materiality and this idea of the stakeholder changing. And one of the practices when you talk about boardroom and executive team that we're seeing in the market is people are increasing the frequency so that they can have a pulse on the risk, the opportunity, and the change. And we went through an exercise with our ESG task force this last quarter in our pulse check, and it was, here was the executive responses. Here's kind of the frameworks and standards overlay in it. And now we're in the next phase where we're going out and pulse checking with our stakeholders, external stakeholders. And we're saying, okay, external stakeholders, what is now the map change, like impact to the business and impact to society? So that through automation, through the tech, they can see as you pulse check these issues changing or moving. I think as we think about dynamic materiality and stakeholder engagement, you're exactly right. We also have to think about what is happening in society in that moment that impacts behavior. So when a lot of these stakeholder engagements were done during COVID, they're going to change this year. They're going to look different as we have evolved into a new normal. And consumer behavior may change if you're a US based company. If you look at politics, right? As we head into an election year, there may be different changes in your stakeholder behavior that can have that risk and opportunity. You talked a little bit about Fink's letter, and Fink's original letter actually focused on governance, right? And so it was kind of, in the asset management community, finance community, there was a little bit of like, okay, you're talking about what we've always talked about, which is really good governance. And your newsletter kind of said, wait, we've reached this phase where E and S have sort of overshadowed governance. So tell us more about what are some of those risks for overlooking governance, and how can a company get better at making sure we just don't see it as a stakeholder game of something we've been doing for years?
Yeah, this is such a great question that I've been thinking a lot about lately. The E and the S tend to overshadow everything right now, and I think it's because coming out of 2020, we just had a confluence of risk between hitting everybody. Extreme weather in the global north for the first time in dramatic ways. We had COVID, of course. We had the murder of George Floyd and that buildup of racial tension in the US. And I feel like since then, the E and the S really are in the spotlight. Now, what's interesting to me is that when I hear people talk about governance, and by the way, I came into the space from financial services and mostly look at the time when, it was 2020, 2019, when the E and the S was building, that pressure was building. So even I came into it from then. But when it comes to governance, and I hear people who have been at it longer than I have, they talk about governance should be first in the acronym. To Larry, to your point about Larry Fink's letter, That's how you start it. It's the governance, it's the things you've always talked about. But I actually like that it's last. And the reason is because I feel like governance is the final gatekeeper across every opportunity, whether it's ES or something more fundamental and material to the business. It is the last gate before any change should be made out there. And it involves all the wild complexity that you were just talking about in this world of interconnected risks and what's happening now. All of that needs to be layered on, and it happens at that last level before you make the final decision to move across interconnected risks, the ethics that you take, what's going on in your company, all your stakeholders. That governance piece is so critical. But in a world where these stakeholder pressures are really focused on the E and the S, it can be difficult, it can be easy to lose sight of just how powerful that governance is. And if a company starts slipping there, governance is really the one thing out of the ES and G that I think can take companies down. And that's what I think we saw with SVB.
I think building on that, what I'm seeing is a change in governance too, where it used to be you would have maybe an ESG committee or one portion of your board of directors. And we were talking on a panel at Reuters in this past month or two and looking at how governance is changing. Even if I think of our own practice, we're looking at where within the board, different charters and committees, do we have environment, social, and governance accountability that is relevant to that area of the board or relevant to that executive's accountability stream? And so you're starting to see a shift where we look at all the material issues at an organization, and the audit and risk committee of the board is really focusing on the disclosures and the reporting and the sign-offs of that from the board level to the CFO level and the CEO level, to the non-gov really looking at the governance and the strategy of the organization and compensation, then thinking about the executive accountability. So I think we're seeing, even as we enter into a new world of governance, the way we do governance is changing. The second thing that we're seeing is the accountability of the material issues are really coming down to this KPIs. It's not the ESG team. It's assigned to the executive that has the accountability and the oversight to help build that responsibility to stakeholders, both internally and externally. So knowing that governance is changing, knowing that we are seeing a drive for greater accountability, how should we be thinking about governance as an opportunity, not just a risk?
You know, it's really interesting. As of late, I've been reading a lot of corporate governance guidelines to see what different companies are focused on. And what I'm coming to realize is that those frameworks, while kind of high level, they don't really get into the weeds. They're really just words on the page. In order to use governance to capture new opportunities, you really have to have that accountability that you mentioned. You need structures in place, not only words on a page, but structures in place to keep that governance top of mind for the board, for executives. And even what's interesting to think about is, most of my career has not been spent here at Microsoft. I had a career in IT, and corporate governance was always a thing. I never heard anybody talk about corporate governance as an individual contributor. I felt it, like I could feel it in the culture of the company. I knew personally from an ethical perspective what I thought was right, what the company would tolerate, what it wouldn't, as I made decisions about the business. But I think with this intense focus on the E and the S right now, I think employees need, like individual contributors even, need to be reminded of this thing. How does the company operate? What are they willing to tolerate? What does matter and what doesn't? And just as an example, because I can give you an example from Microsoft. We have internal ethics training on an annual basis. And if you scour the social media sites, you might learn a little bit about it, but I'll give you a little taste of what it's like. It runs like a Netflix series. It is the most incredible thing I've ever seen, where there are seasons, and every season you kind of get this flavor of fictional employees working at Microsoft and how they would approach different ethical issues through storytelling. That type of engagement with employees, reminds them of governance without telling them, hey, this is governance. This is how we should be acting. And because I could go out and cause Microsoft a huge issue, in what I say or what I do, having that reminder for employees when they're, granted, there are tons of issues that they need to focus on with the E and the S, don't get me wrong. But in order to make sure the company is around to solve those E and S issues, you really need to make sure that everybody understands governance well.
Well, and I think that you hit on a unique position there where it's also where it's most material to your business. So I think in businesses like our cybersecurity is one of the biggest protections that we can offer our stakeholders, our external stakeholders. And so there are going to be relevant governance and social trainings where those two collide. And you have to think through it from both the risk side of your business as well as the opportunity side. And I think we had an episode earlier with Jared on Forvis where we talked about risk scenario testing and ways that you can implement that as a standard practice in a workshop model or unique models. I love that you ended with a really strong practical tip. I think another practical tip is look at your employee journey, look at the entire employee experience, and start to pin up with your teams where are all the points where you have experiences like you just talked about, and where are the points that you have education or listening or learning moments. And you may find it could be as simple as when this is the best practice somebody shared with me a while ago, was when we share our development plans, we actually have our environmental, social, and governance issues and goals listed in the development plans, and they get to select which goal, which area, which strategy their development plans align to. It's not necessarily a requirement, but to your point, it's a unique way of infusing, just in the fact that you're setting your development plans, how a key issue like governance should be on an employee's radar as they are growing and as they are developing. So this has been a fun time together, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll put in the show notes your newsletter so that people can check out the ESG Advocate. And to you, our audience, thanks for joining so much. It's been fun to unpack a hot topic in the moment as we all had this experience in March to watch, learn, and grow, and ultimately end with how we can have better practice in governance. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or subscribe to future episodes on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. We'll look forward to talking real soon.